I'm back. It is Bones, and in this one, we're going to take a look at my top 5 figures that, although were kind of a disappointment upon release, I did go ahead and spice them up a little bit, add a little bit of details, change them up to make them more what I was expecting from McFarlane. Now, this does happen sometimes. McFarlane pretty much just releases a figure, doesn't pay attention to the details. You can even say sort of lazy releases. And once I get them in hand, I'm not very happy with them. But once I do a little bit of customizing, they end up being some of my favorite figures. Now, this will all point to the fact that most of these should have been in my top 20 of 2023. You could check that video out right now. And that is basically why I omitted most of these from that list, is because although they have become some of my favorite figures, they were not upon their initial release. Now, I can't really consider them top 20 because I had to customize them and paint them and redo them to make them something more of what I was expecting. But this is also how you can take an okay release from McFarlane and make it an awesome looking figure to add to your collection. Now, first up, I do have one honorable mention, and that is going to be my Robin. What is this? Tim Drake Robin? I think it's Robin Reborn. Now, this was a highly anticipated release from McFarlane. You do have the original release, which was the all red costume. And a lot of people were really waiting for this version where he had the actual colors correct on the arms. And upon initial release, although a lot of people said it was an okay figure, it was sort of a big disappointment. Now, I would have to say a lot of this goes because of the head sculpt that they chose to go with. But also for me, it just goes down to McFarlane having the parts already in his, arsenal of figures. And he just decides to use something else that does not represent what the look is in the comics. Now, when you take a look at my version, I did use the original release head, although the domino mask is slightly different. It just looks a lot better on this body. Another thing I changed was the actual chest piece, the upper torso, because if you look side by side with the original release, McFarlane went with that sort of armored, bulky design that does not really fit with how Tim Drake looked in the comics in this uniform. Now, one of the big differences that I actually used the upper torso from the Three Jokers Red Hood, which for me aesthetically fit a lot better with this version of Tim Drake as Robin. Now, I did have to repaint a lot of the parts like the trunks and the utility belt to match this version of the figure. But in the end, I was really happy with the way this came out. Now, it's not one of my favorite redos because I can look at this guy, but it's not a figure I really go back to. So that's why he's not, the number one on this list. But he is an honorable mention because this one, for me, I feel looks a lot better. Just the way the head sculpt fits with this version is way more appealing to the eye than the original head sculpt. There's just something, I want to say, derpy about that original head sculpt, and I do not know why they went with that head sculpt. Now, another, big difference was that originally he came with this big, bulky staff, which, it just does not fit proportionately with this figure because he's more of a slim down figure. And although the original release is sort of bulky, it just does not fit well. Now, I went ahead and made my own staff, which I really wish McFarlane would have gone with one of the other staffs that he has in-house or something more slimmer like this version. It just fits way better with the figure and gives it a more streamlined feel. But overall, I am really happy with this custom. Took a lot of work because I did have to change the neck parts so that this head would actually fit on here. matching up with the original top torso that I used from the Three Jokers Red Hood. But in the end, I do feel like I have a better representation of Tim Drake from Robin Reborn, and that is my honorable mention on this list. Now, coming in at number 5, we do have my version of the Justice Lord from the Batman Beyond 2-pack. Really, the only figure that I was interested in that 2-pack, because I am a big fan of the sort of white and black color scheme with a little hint of red in there that the Justice Lord Superman usually uses. Awesome figure, awesome base figure. I just was not completely happy with some of the details. Now, if you look at the head on my version, I actually added a little bit of white streaks to the temples because it's more of a gray color, while it is supposed to have more of a hint of white on that aging hair of the Kryptonian. I added a little bit of blue highlights to give the hair a little bit more life. And I did add a dark wash to the face just to bring out some of those stern features and darker tones that you find in the crevices of the face. Looks a hell of a lot better. And the last thing I did is I did add a very tiny dot of white right in the middle of the pupils of those heat vision eyes just to make them pop a little bit more. Now, aside from that, I did paint the whole neck white, whereas the original release has sort of that turtleneck version where it's, stops halfway, sort of cropped. I did, for some reason, I don't know why, later on I did find out that that is how it is in most iterations of this character, but I wanted the white all the way up to underneath the chin. And for me, I just feel like it gives a more, it's hard to explain, like a tyrannical or regal look to this Justice Lord Superman. Now, moving down on the figure, I didn't want to add anything to the belts, although it is just painted on, which was another, you know, sort of thing. I think McFarlane should have went more with a sculpted out belt, and I added this sort of white buckle just to give it a little bit more depth, so it actually feels like there's something there instead of just the painted on version from the original release. Now, I did raise this figure in height doing the thigh lift, which actually gives him more of a intimidating stature, especially next to that Batman Beyond figure. And I just like my Superman a little bit more taller. So it's something pretty much automatic that that I do with a lot of Superman from McFarlane, is give them a little bit more height, which actually reminds me I did lift the neck peg to raise his head a little bit more so that his head doesn't seem so, scrunched down on the neck, and actually gives him a lot more movement in articulation. Now, I did also change the hands because, of course, we know in the source material, Justice Lord Superman is usually portrayed wearing gloves, and the original release came with bare hands. Now, this was a process. I did actually seal them first with some sealer to get rid of the actual fingernail sculpt that is in the original hands. And once that dried, I painted a satin black to make it match the rest of the plastics on this figure. But I think those gloved hands really give them a little bit more of a finished feel than those gloveless hands did. For me, it just feels a little bit more like a Justice Lord. And finally, going down the the biggest faux pas that McFarlane did was actually just paint the details of the upper band around the top of the boot, and you could actually see the old sculpt on there, which is really distracting when you're looking at this figure. So what I went ahead and did is I wanted it to actually match the upper wrist part, which is, you have a sort of a raised band, and then the second band is actually just painted on. So I wanted to have the upper boot band raised up and then just keep the lower band painted on, just so it could kind of match a little bit. So I went ahead and added some fodder to give it that raised look, and then I painted it white. So all in all, after all these changes, this is a great Justice Lord figure Looks really good, really accurate to the comics. The added articulation, the added height, and the paint details really bring this one to the next level, where now he is one of my favorite Superman figures from McFarlane. So I have to reiterate, that is why he was not on my top 20, is because I had him saved to be on this actual list, because I did have to put in some work to make him something that I really enjoyed. Now, coming in at number 4, we do have the Nightwing from Teen Titans. Now, a lot of people were very dissatisfied with this release from McFarlane. I do have the original release. You can look at it here side by side. And the main thing that was the problem was that he didn't come with open hands. He didn't come with his Eskrima sticks, and he had no storage for the sticks. Now, I kind of took it as that this version of Dick Grayson was a sort of teen Nightwing. So he didn't really have everything down on his costume and all of his, weapons. But that's kind of reaching. I do know that everybody was still not happy that he had no open hands to hold the sticks and he had no sticks. So although McFarlane can kind of make a case that he only had fists, so what sticks was he going to hold? People were not completely happy with this release. Now, what they were happy with was the head sculpt. And although I was a big fan of the head sculpt, one thing I did not like was the hair that kind of hanged right in the middle of his face. I think it kind of detracted from the beautiful head sculpt on this Nightwing that really captures that Teen Titan Dick Grayson look. So that was some of the first changes that I did. I did, take off that hair and then add it on to another side. I actually split it and added two different curls to his hair and then added some blue highlights just to make it pop. And I think that the head sculpt looks way better without that distracting hanging bang. Now, I'm not against this. Me, I have long hair, so I always have hair in front of my face, but I just really thought it took away from the Dick Grayson head sculpt that you get with this figure. Now, another big positive of this figure was the color of blue that they used on his uniform. Now, it did kind of give me a little bit of trouble because when I tried to match it, it was a little bit difficult, but finally I did figure it out. Now, I did want to match it because first thing I did was actually paint the shoulder bushings, the rings, because they were just one solid color, black. And I actually wanted them to have that two-tone feel where when you lift up the arm, you get black underneath. And when you put down the arm, you could see that blue pop through. So that was one of the changes I made. Now, I did give him some open hands where I did have to match the stripe that runs down his uniform into the hand. So that was pretty fun. But now he does have his open hands for his sticks. Now, I did do some custom sticks, actually making two sticks from two different versions of the batons that I had in my fodder box. But I was really happy with them because they are a more slender stick and they actually fit better with this more slimmed down version of Dick Grayson. Now, finally, on the back, I did go ahead and add the storage for his sticks, just something that I took off of the original Nightwing release and just made it fit. Still being able to see that Nightwing symbol on the back, which was a detail that I really enjoyed. So it actually worked out very well. And now that is a really awesome Nightwing from the Teen Titans. Another little detail that I added was actually at the bottom of the shoes because the trim of the foot actually did have that blue, aqua blue color, but I wanted to add it to the bottom of the soles just to give it that added little detail that I enjoy. But now this is an awesome Dick Grayson Nightwing from the Titans. He has everything you would want, the sticks, the storage, awesome head sculpt. But once again, I did have to make this version myself. But that is number 4 for my top redone McFarlane figures. Now, coming in at number 3, we do have Jim Gordon as Batman. Now, I had really high hopes for this figure. And although I'm really basically happy with the general release, that head sculpt just did not fit on this figure. Too big, and although you can see the similarities between the masked version and the unmasked version, I just still felt they were like a little bit too large for the body. Now, although Jim Gordon isn't a huge, mass monster, once he trimmed down to be Batman, he was a more slender version of Batman. I just wanted a figure that fit a little bit better. Now, I actually was one of the first people. You could look up the video and look the date that I actually put it out to show this head sculpt, which is the rebirth head sculpt on the Jim Gordon Batman body. And although I did see other videos afterwards, I'm not all, psycho like some some shills, and I didn't go and say, "Oh, I did this first, take your video down." Like, I could care less. I would rather everybody be happy with their version of Jim Gordon as Batman, regardless of who gets the credit or who came out with it first. But what I am happy about is this figure in a whole. I love this figure now. That head sculpt just completely takes it to a whole nother level. Now, one thing a lot of people didn't do that I actually did was I actually added the holster to his hip, because in the original version it is just a sort of pouch. And he does have that sort of a batarang firing grapnel gun that actually fires the batarangs, which looks really good and is done really well. But I just really wanted it to have a holster. So I did make my own holster. You can take out the gun. There it is without the batarang connected, and you can easily slip it back in. So it actually is very functional, works really well. It did take me some work to actually get it to strap onto the original straps. But once I had it done, it is really snug and it fits perfectly with this figure. Now, another added detail I did that a lot of people didn't do, and this was actually from looking at the DC Direct version of this figure, is add the gray soles to the bottom of his shoes. Now, this is just, like I said, a personal detail that I add, but it really does something for these figures. It's just a cool little accent to the costume. And once you pick this figure up with all the added details, the changed head sculpt, the holster, the painted soles, it is a really fun figure. Very hard to put down. I could pose this guy for hours and I just do not get tired of it. Beautiful, beautiful figure, but sadly, it is not in its original form the way McFarlane released it. It is something that I actually created, which actually makes it a little bit more personable and makes me enjoy this figure even more. Now, the runner up on this list, actually one I had a lot of fun doing, and that is going to be Supergirl. Now, some people did ask me why I didn't have Supergirl on my top 20, and the whole reason is because the standard release of Supergirl is an okay figure if you're just a random consumer and you're just a casual fan of Supergirl. It'll be fine for you. It's not it's not a big thing, although some things for me would be very distracting, like the puffy skirt, and something about the face sculpt just didn't do it for me. But of course, I went in and added my own touches. Now, this is one of my favorite figures of the year. Love posing her, love standing her around, love putting her in flight poses. But the sad thing is, this is not how she was originally released. But I did do some awesome changes. If you start at the head, which is something that a lot of people don't notice, is that the original release, she didn't have any sort of, um, I want to say, like makeup around the eyes. So that kind of took away from like the smoky eye that she can actually have, or like the sultriness of the face sculpt. And if you see them side by side, you can actually see where I actually painted in what would, in reality be like the mascara and the shade around the eyes. And it just makes her look a lot better, a lot more attractive. And those eyes don't look sort of like zombie eyes, which is another one of my pet peeves, is like straight looking unliving eyes. Once I saw it for the first time, I just cannot, not see it. But with the added detail of black around the eyes, it really makes her look a lot better. Now, one thing I had planned from when I first saw her was to actually change the midriff and give her an actual bare naked midriff, which is actually true to a lot of the versions of Supergirl in the comics and in action figure form. And then, of course, I cut down her skirt to reveal more of her legs. Now, that would be another problem, is that McFarlane just painted her legs completely red, which I thought really took away from what a lot of collectors would want to see in a Supergirl figure. So I went ahead and repainted them in a flesh tone. And of course, yeah, yes, she definitely looks a lot better with the short skirt, a little bit of skin showing. It's not going to hurt nobody. But what it does do is take this figure to a whole nother level. Now she is definitely one of my favorite figures. Like I said before, between posing her around and articulating her before the changes and after the changes, it just is a completely different thing. She's awesome now. I love having her in the collection. Although I do have a standard version just for, prosperity, but this is actually my favorite version. Love this figure. She would have definitely been in the top 20, but not without having to do all of this work on her. And hey, she's a good seller for McFarlane, for your casual collector, but just for something that real collectors want, this version cannot be beat. So finally, we have made it to my number one figure that I took from zero to hero, and that is going to be the platinum version of Hawkman from the collector's edition from McFarlane. Now, here I do have the original release, and there was a couple of problems I had with the original release, but actually, as a 90s form of Hawkman, he is very true and he is a great figure, which should have been in my top 20, but I held off on him because I wanted to spotlight this classic version of Hawkman that I actually built. Now, one thing about this Hawkman is that I had to use the actual platinum version because it just had more details that were set up more for a classic version of Hawkman. If you were to use this 90s version, you could still get there, but it was way more painting that I wanted to do. And actually, I already had to do enough on this guy. Now, I did start by taking off the hair from the head sculpt, covered that up, went down, and I actually had to add on, some epoxy sculpt and paint to the arm to make him have two bare arms, because he did have that gauntlet on the right arm, and once you remove that, it has that big distorted look. So I had to add the epoxy, sculpt it out, sand it, paint it, and get it to match. But in the end, after all of that, I was really happy with it. Now, I did have to add also the wings from the Tyrant Joker. Been holding on to these for a long time to have a good use for them. And I finally decided just to go ahead and use them on this classic version of Hawkman. Now, I did also change the trunks because these, weird sculpted trunks just didn't do it for me, especially for a classic version of Hawkman. So I used some other trunks that were a more smooth detail, gave him a pure yellow solid belt, which is more accurate to the comic versions of your classic Hawkman. And then the biggest, hardest thing I had to do was switch out the boots for a little bit more traditional Hawkman boots than the ones that were given with this figure. Painstakingly had to paint it, get the yellow stripe down the middle, match the stripe in the ankle ball joint, and then match it on the boot and add the little talons that go down the side of the boots. Pretty large task to build your own classic Hawkman. Now, once I was done with everything, absolutely one of my favorite figures of the year. Did go ahead and add some weapons. I added the shield, the battle damage shield, and I also added a lot of details to his mace. But all in all, really happy with the end product. It's just that you have to add a lot of work to get a version of a classic Hawkman. Now, there is two sides of this, and that is that McFarlane could put a little bit more work and more add, a little bit more attention to detail when he's doing these releases to make them look more accurate. But we do know that McFarlane is playing the numbers game where he's trying to sell as many figures as fast as he can, keeping the price point down and trying to make everybody happy at once. Now, the other side of this coin is that without the base Hawkman figure, I would never be able to build this custom Hawkman. I mean, in theory, you could build a classic Hawkman, but it would take tons of new sculpt, tons of, mismatching of parts just to make a Hawkman from scratch. I mean, it's pretty much like something that just in hours and not even figure cost of figures, it would cost a lot to make your own classic Hawkman from scratch. But McFarlane at least gave me a halfway point where I did have to do some work, but I didn't have to start from nothing. I had a base figure there to start. And who knows, in the future, he may eventually give us a more classic looking Hawkman. But I feel like if you actually have that platinum collector's edition Hawkman, that's pretty close to a classic version, except for all the details that, comic book aficionados would actually notice that the details are more set for a 90s Hawkman. But, anyways, guys, those are my favorite redone figures from McFarlane for 2023. Not the best figures upon their initial release, but with a little love, a little bit of work, you can actually make them some very awesome figures to add to your collection. But anyways, you guys keep hunting out there, keep collecting, keep customizing, and I will see you on the next one.
They used to call me Crazy Joe, but now they can call me Batman.